This will be a piece of my presentation, which is Coimbra, Portugal. It's the site of the oldest university in Portugal and the second oldest university in the Iberian Peninsula. But I want to start off with this, just to give a context for this kind of work. This is really what I came to understand a bunch of years ago, that I'm an intellectual omnivore. I mean, in the real world, I don't like okra very much, and that's kind of about it for my dietary. I'm pretty much of an omnivore in that realm as well, although when I teach in China with our MEM program, there are opportunities for scorpions and tarantulas, and I have not yet gone there, but I'm going back again in a few months. And so the things that I've written about are really all over the place. My master's thesis was on the ecology of ciliated protozoa. These are small things you might have studied in high school, like paramecium, microscopic things that live in lake mud, but I've also studied from microscopic animals, 100 micrometer long animals. I've written on walking speed of dinosaurs. If you saw Jurassic Park, there's a scene where there's a duck-billed dinosaur stampede that are jumping over the guys. There's a couple of meat eaters coming in this way, and the duck-bills are running, and that's based on tracks from northern British Columbia that I wrote about speed. Basically, the end of the story is, for the most of the time, dinosaurs walked. But okay. Oh, what happened there? Okay, and because I like small things and big things, my musical instruments, I play a lot of instruments. I play the recorder, which is the smallest one I play, and I'm a string bass and a tuba player. So you see, this is just, who I am. I wrote work on before the word Nuchalnuth was being used, about Northwest Coast Indian whaling. The anthropologist who knew nothing about whales because they weren't omnivorous enough wrote wrongly about what the Nuchalnuth people were doing. I've also have an interest in sex and wrote 3 papers or 3 slideshows, some of which have been published. Collectively, they were called the Sin on the Seashore Trilogy. The first one is Sex on the Seashore, which started out as reproduction on the rocks, but all the zero population people got into it. So we talked Sex on the Seashore. The second one is intertidal intimacies. It's all about symbiotic relationships in the seashore. And the third one was called Bondage on the Beach. And it's about escape responses. So I like alliterative titles, so I've done that kind of stuff. That was sent off to Playboy, by the way, and they didn't buy it. It was because crabs have 2 peni and vaginae, and the Playboy guys couldn't deal with it. This was published in a BC government publication called Wildlife Review. They had never published anything on sex ever, and then they did this. I worked in museums for a long time. I did research on looking at the effectiveness of exhibits. I wrote a piece in the journal Nature. One of my high spots was getting a letter to the editor published in Nature. And of course, I've written a lot about environmental education at varying points. My work in museums and in environment ministry. My dissertation, though, my master's was on ciliated protozoans, and my dissertation was really about philosophy, was about action and education, about doing things, about the moral weight of knowledge. And you'll see that comes out in some of the stuff that I'll be talking about today. I've written stuff because I have an interest in religion. I also have written stuff about animals in religion. This was published in a journal called Worldviews as a result of a little conference that was held up at the UVic Center for Study of Religion and Society. I'm interested in hope and fear and the future. And this article has been republished a bunch of times. It just republished in an anthology about environmental things for teenagers that I just got on my desk just last week, came out. I'm interested, I said, in religion things and environmental things, and I had an article published in a journal called Ecological Economics. I've never taken, well, truthfully, I dropped economics as an undergraduate, the only course I ever dropped. But I looked at contemporary environmental scientists and biblical prophets and tried to show how these guys and women are actually walking in very similar ways. What prophets did in Bible times was not to predict the future, but instead to warn about, to accurately describe the present and warn about future actions. And, that's what contemporary environmental science is much about, accurately describing the present and warning about the future. So that was kind of a cool thing to get published. And then, I'm interested in the past and future. This just came out I'm interested in violence. I'm often interested in topics that seem to not be spoken about. So in environmental education, the word violence, like the word in 2005 when I first started writing about hope, didn't appear. The word violence doesn't appear. So I put some stuff together. This was nice working in a place like this where I can learn from our justice studies colleagues and get a little leg up on a domain I've not had any experience with. Oh, that showed up. I've also had a species named for me. This is really a high point in the life of biologists. As I said, I used to work on dinosaur tracks. I found a little slab of rocks in a museum in Dawson Creek. I couldn't figure out what they were. I was going to a folk festival in Regina, Saskatchewan. I knew there was a guy at the University of Saskatchewan who was a big guy on fossil tracks. I thought, well, I could just easily drop in one night and see him, until I looked at the geography of Saskatchewan and realized you don't just drop in. So, but it turns out W.A.S. Sargent, also known as Bill Sargent, was also performing at the Regina Folk Festival, which is kind of a weird thing. And so we spoke about this track. I sent him a copy of this little footprint like this from the Peace River in the Dawson Creek Museum with two tiny footprints in it. These footprints looked more or less like that. They were way smaller than anything I'd ever seen in a dinosaur, and they didn't give a dinosaur feel. And as you can see from the title, they're probably marsupial footprints, that is, pouched animals. They're the earliest tracks, the earliest remains of any marsupial animal, probably from the lower Cretaceous, and you have to give them a scientific name. So the genus name is Duquette ichnus. They were found by this guy we know nothing about. We can't find anything about him, Mr. R.D. Duquette. He probably worked on the mine, on the dam, in the Peace Canyon Dam. And you'll notice the species name is Kool. Now, if you want to become immortal, there are ways of doing it, but this is one, especially to get a species named for you. So, these things, there are payoffs to this in a way that some of you social scientists may never, ever have. But that was, so when I go to projects to research, my inclination is to say, well, what's interesting around me now that I could play around with? And I had this sense that I wanted to write something that I had never written before. And when I go to trying to write something, I think about books that I like. And what I realize, I like books by their weight. I like little books that don't weigh much. One of my favorite books is The Aims of Education by Alfred North Whitehead. This book starts off, he says, "Culture is receptiveness to beauty and humane thought. Scraps of information have nothing to do with it. A merely well-informed man is the most useless bore on God's earth." That's how Whitehead starts this. I like this book. I like Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Many of you are aware of it. It's maybe 200 pages long. I really like John Dewey's book, Education and Experience. It's probably like 80 pages long or so. What I don't like are books like this, 504 pages. It would break your nose if it fell on your face if you're reading it in bed. I tell biology students when I'm teaching biology courses, buy a textbook, best price per kilo. Right? Because it's all the same and just get a good deal on paper. So I had this idea of writing a small book. And a book that always has impressed me as one of the model, elegant little books is the book by the kind of fabulous, realist Italian author, Italo Calvino, called 6 Memos for the Next Millennium. Calvino was invited to Harvard University in 1984 or so to give the Charles Eliot Norton lectures. And maybe some of you had the Norton anthology when you were going to university, and that's that Norton. And he put together 5 lectures from his home in Torino, had a stroke and died. He never delivered them, never went to Cambridge. And they had these beautiful titles: lightness, quickness, exactitude, visibility, multiplicity. And his wife said the last manuscript, which she could never find, was going to be named Constancy. And these were memos about where literature was going in the next millennium. And I love this. This is a really special little thin book. Each essay is mainly 4, maybe 5,000 words. They're not big, complex pages. And I thought, I'd be interested in thinking, could I do this? I mean, I really did want to do it, and maybe if I thought about it long enough, I could try it at least. I knew I wanted to do a small book. Maybe I could model it on Calvino. I'd have to figure out who the heck I was writing it for, but I thought, maybe that's something I could do. I've never done it before, maybe never have a chance to do it again. So I applied for a study leave. One of the great things that unionization has done for the faculty here, beyond giving them tenure, beyond giving them a lot more respect with the management, is the study leave. So I decided, where was I going to start my study leave? Well, right down here in James Bay. And I started writing at home. And there's a problem with that. I mean, I had things to write. I got this paper done that I collaborated with my wife on. It's a small thing, but it was very meaningful to me because this use that I see every place of best practice language, the use of best practice, it just was really bugging me. You look at the use of this in the environmental, this is in Google searches, just this growth of use of the word best practice. And in the environmental world, all of these organizations, most of which are trying to sell something, are talking about best practice. So, I didn't like it. I don't like the phrase. I think it has a philosophically bad taste to it. So we wrote up some stuff about that, and that is, we're playing with the journal around that now because in some ways I'm criticizing the people who are the editors of the journal. You've maybe had that experience, but there are lots of problems with claiming you have the best practice. Offers of unrealistic certainty. The owners becoming gatekeepers, and I'm sure discovering that. There's an idea that best practice is best practice, and it can result in a mental lock-in idea. There are all sorts of problems. So, we're talking about things like this. Anyways, we wrote this. I like this line of imitation with a path to excellence. Art museums we filled with paint-by-number pictures, So maybe best practice is not the best phrase or the best idea for us. And especially in new fields where so much is contentious, to say at the outset that something is best, I think is very problematic. And I wrote that with my buddies a long time ago. So got that done. But then what I began feeling in my incipient study leave was, I use EndNote. Maybe some of you use it. You can see at this point there's like 62 or 68, 6,500 references. So I have a big EndNote collection. As I said, I'm an intellectual omnivore as I began. And I can never find my books. And any of you have that problem of never find your books? So I'm sitting at home, I'm writing, and I think, I can start to label my books. I can catalog them finally and organize them properly. There's a cool little website that will give you the Library of Congress classification for your books. So I began doing that as part of my study leave. It seemed like it was a way, it was actually a huge displacement activity, right? But it was really great. And as a librarian here, Tim, I hope you're, I hope you're happy. I only use the two letters and the numbers. It is sufficient. And I just started plowing through my reference lists, all my books, putting them into the appropriate place here in my EndNote files. I can't imagine any of you who write would not use some kind of bibliography software. And that was really great. This was really great. But I kept on coming back to Italo Calvino. And I knew if I wanted to write a little book in the spirit of Calvino, I don't think I was going to do it in James Bay. I just really had that sense that I needed to go somewhere else. I have never really gone somewhere else to write, other than maybe Saturna Island when I was trying to finish my dissertation. And this was just, I was on a study leave. Like, I could do this. I come from a very blue-collar background. I didn't even know I could fly in airplanes because people like me didn't do that kind of thing. And now I know I can. So this is where I went. I just can't see how that little mouse will do it for me otherwise.
I can be your person if you want me to stand there.
Okay, I don't think there's none more.
Okay.
So I just got on an airplane and flew across Canada and ended up in sort of the middle of Portugal, in a city that I discovered while I was there. One of my ancestors left during the Inquisition in 1600, even though the Jewish communities here, there were Jewish communities all through this part of Portugal. I ended up at the University of Coimbra. It's the oldest one, 1290, founded in Portugal. The university in Salamanca in Spain is the oldest one of the Iberian peninsulas. This is the second oldest one. And there I am, in Coimbra. Clock tower, old library in the back there. And this is where I spent 3 months, from the 1st of April to the 30th of June, the Center for Study of Society. I had a friend there, Alison Nielsen, used to be out she was in the Azores, at the university in the Azores, and that's when I first contacted her. I thought the Azores would be fun, and then she tells me she's moved to Coimbra. And Coimbra is even more fun. Alison does a lot of work in environmental stuff. She's a Canadian from outside of Toronto. She's pretty wild. She does a lot of work she clowns. She does a lot of work on art and artistic ways of knowing. And her and her partner Antonio were really great, just helping me find a place to get into and to move to Coimbra. It was a beautiful place. This is where I lived, the street of the olive sellers. And that word, the azeiteras, is apparently a Sephardic, a Ladino word, a Jewish word. This was a street of Jewish olive sellers that I ended up on. But then I love the other ones, the Palace of Confusion. And then, of course, the Inquisition was never far away. The Spanish Inquisition is never far away. And so they burnt people at the end of my street, and then there was the larger Patio de Inquisição where the Inquisition offices were held. And this was and always with these beautiful tiles. So I got into this. This also, lots of graffiti. That was a sense when, this was in the beginning of the spring, when the Trump stuff was really beginning to happen. This was showing up. A lot of anti-fascist stuff was going up all over the city. And the city is full. It's been a university city for over 1,000 years. And the students wear uniforms. And this is their uniform. They wear black pants, a white shirt, black tie, black vest, a 19th century style jacket, and they all wear capes. And they play music. It's a huge musical city. And this is like 9 o'clock in the morning, and these guys are out just getting a little bit of stuff before they go up to class. These are a group of pharmacy students getting ready to take their final exams. They looked pretty good for getting ready to take final exams, but that's what the students look like. Thousands of them, thousands and thousands of them dressed like that. So we'll get to my research, but I just wanted to give you a feeling of this. Yeah, if you want to see if that'll go. So this is now like 5 or so minutes. This is how the university is on the top of a hill. I'll just show you what Coimbra looks like and how I get to the top of the hill. I stayed in a hostel. I was the old guy by far at the hostel. Into this narrow little alley, print shop across the street. My neighbor was a postdoc from Spain, he would say from Catalonia, and then a Portuguese doctoral student next to him, and there were 2 Turkish women across the street. This is a 12th century Church of Santiago, and you're going up from the patio, from the Praça de Comércio, which is the oldest of the large areas in the old part of the city, down the main street of the town, and you just keep on going up. Here are some of the gates,
up through the
old walled gates to the old part of the city. On the left, you'll see there's a brass sculpture of a Coimbra guitar as a woman, including pubic hair. And this is, the Coimbra guitar is very beautiful. It's a very musical place. People have played music every day as I would walk up and down the students outside performing.
Yet this morning.
Sometimes dancing, sometimes going to tourists. They're just doing it for themselves. Clubs of students dance and sing all the time in Coimbra. They raise money for this huge debauch, which I'll show you at the very, very end of it.
During the
That's
day,
what they're raising money for.
Staircase
Again,
is filled.
Going up, you see
out of
the
breath
tourists who are been on buses for weeks, and they're starting to breathe hard here. It's cobblestone, It's limestone. When it's wet, it's slippery. And you just keep on climbing up. The railings are useful. There's bathrooms, public toilets on the side. I'm walking right eastward, going into the sun, going up the hill. They talk about the university as being, there's two campuses. There's the lower campus, which is Sophia, on Rua Sophia, Wisdom. And then the campus I was going to was the Alta campus. So you got high and wise, the two pieces of the University of Coimbra. The old cathedral, Sevilla, is here on the top of this higher level in cobblestone streets. This is also, 12th century or a little bit earlier. It looks like a fort, and I guess in those days it was a fort because right across the river were the Muslims. And they traded and everything, but they still had buildings. Very steep.
Cars are a
I
hard
saw a
time.
car miss that and end up with wheels over
I'm going to
the
go the other direction.
concrete.
There's two ways to go to the
They were
university.
Dutch, which really
As you can see
terrible
the signs here.
Dutch to do. They don't understand hills, in Holland. They just don't know what they're like ants, desert ants that don't know how to go up. So you just keep on. Yeah, you can keep desert ants in cookie trays because they get to the end and they turn. They just don't
And these
get
are the
this
Roman
idea.
ruins on
That.
the
And the
side.
Dutch are like that.
Underneath the beautiful.
So again, just going up this route, a large museum on the left. These are remains of Roman, of a large Roman organizational complex that has been excavated. It's quite extraordinary and just a beautiful, beautiful art museum. Of course, the church, the state took all the beautiful stuff away from the Catholic churches at different points. I have growing up in Boston, where people were either Irish or Italian, I have a huge affinity for Catholicism, early Catholic art. And
Medical
that's,
school.
where I would go to naturally, and the museum up here, named for one of the Portuguese artists, Machado de Castro,
Museum's entrance.
is in very, very beautiful stuff. But these are all old churches that have been converted into classrooms now and museums. During the dictatorship, a lot of the old buildings were removed and pardoned, put up with more of the 60s brutalism style. But I'm not at the top yet. We're going to continue to go up.
The new church.
That's the new cathedral, up the flights of stairs right into the sun. At this point, I am beginning to get a little sweaty. And I'm, in reasonably good shape. I bicycle from James Bay out to here, and I'm going to the gym while I'm in Coimbra. But you're just going up like this the whole time. This is the new cathedral. This is more of the 1700s.
It's pretty beautiful, really baroque.
18th century, I guess.
Late.
That was the
Romance.
Jesuit college on the side there. These were all Catholic colleges. The whole city was
Biochemistry.
Catholic colleges. This is now the biochemistry.
You can see the cool patterns on the
When
side.
this building was built, chemistry was still a new subject, right? What was biochemistry?
And the building.
Medical schools on the
my right,
right-hand
medical
side.
school.
They have an excellent medical
my
school, one of the
guess,
top ones in
on the
in
left
the Iberian
was the
Peninsula.
hospital.
And where I'm heading to
When the
used to be a hospital.
monasteries
It was a
were
hospital for maybe 400
The
years.
College of St.
I mean,
Jerome.
we can't keep
St.
hospitals
Geronimo.
going for 50 years or 60 years, and they're going for centuries. The architecture building is up. The department is straight ahead, beautiful courtyards in there. But we're going to the old College of San Geronimo,
The entrance.
and there's a
the college.
impressive sculpture
San Geronimo.
of Saint
In front of
Jerome
me,
in the entrance here.
which was a
These are
hospital for
very
300
magical
years or
doorways, these
200
monstrous
years or something ridiculous like
entrances
that.
to all of the old university buildings. Fancy sculptures, big wooden doors.
All these doors.
For those of you that are European, this is more common. For North Americans, this is, I'm just always knocked out by it. The Portuguese are big on tiles, so, just tiles every place. And then, big, wide stairway, worn stairs from the College of Saint is upstairs there. And then I wander around through this building. This was the hospital, but it had been a castle at one point. And there's all these castle things in here. And down the hallway to a strange door, little secret passage, and there are secret passages all through this place. And into the Center for the Study of Society, and that was where my office was. So let's just give a sense of what Coimbra was like. Now, where did this research stuff start about? Because as I said, I'm interested in a lot of things. In some ways, this all began for me in 1967 with the publication of Marshall McLuhan's book, The Medium is the Massage. You know, people tend to think the medium is the message, but this is the way it was actually printed. It was a typo. The printer did that. And when McLuhan saw it, he thought it was perfect because the medium massages us. So people talk about the medium as the message, but this is the first edition of the medium is the massage. And in the Boston Public Library in April 1967, I was my last year of high school, 17 years old, I heard about this crazy book from this guy in Toronto. And in those days, you requested a book, you walked away, and then you came back to your table, and the book was there. There it was, Marshall McLuhan's book. I opened it up, and it's this picture of a fried egg with a label embossed on the yolk. Touchless printing, what we would call inkjet printing, 1967. What was this about? And there's some other crazy things. This is all still the beginning of the book. I'm kind of knocked out already. And on top of that is this quote. So, the major advances in civilization are processes that all but wreck the societies in which they occur. A.N. Whitehead. Never heard of the guy. And then I find the last page, after this kind of gripping hour or so sitting in the Boston Public Library, the last page is this first picture of the Earth from the moon. And there's this other provocative statement by this A.N. Whitehead. It's the business of the future to be dangerous. And I thought, was he, 1967, was he a hippie out in San Francisco? Whitehead, in fact, was an Edwardian philosopher and mathematician who has become I call him my Anglican Rebbe, really, because he provoked so much of my thinking that in some ways, whatever I'm going to write now is somewhat, I go back to this experience with Whitehead as a 17-year-old in the Boston Public Library. And so what I'm hoping to do in this work that I'm writing is I want to explore these underexplored areas in the domain I work in by creating 6 little short chapters. In the spirit of Italo Calvino, that explore things that we don't think enough about in my domains, at least, and maybe I could explore them, maybe even elegantly as well. So I'd like to just run through some of them. The first part is really about things that we're all aware of, but we don't really confront well. And those 4 words are the first 4 chapters: truth, untruth, stupidity, and bullshit. And then the final 2, I think, will be about courage, because I think that's something we're being called on to exhibit more and more, and the importance of deeds, of action, which goes back to my dissertation. So the truth thing, lots of stuff, if you wanted to fill up a room full of books, truth, you could fill up a room with a lot of books full of truth. So I've taken this is really a quirky book on called Paradigms and Fairy Tales. The woman who wrote this she is really loony. The book is full of magic rabbits and things, but they're all codes for different magic rabbits or golden rabbits are scientists, good scientists, so keen. And she talks about worldview. So it's 2 volumes from the early 70s, I think. But she has an interesting take on truth. And I'm playing with her idea of truth. Because truth, and we do a lot of talking about truth now, with the guy in the White House, that we use one word for truth. And there's a lot of different meanings of truth. And I think we get into trouble when we're using truth in many different ways. So she would just say this kind of truth. Truth 4, she said, is what we learn about in science. You could say it's an empirical truth, that we can demonstrate it in the lab or in nature, in the world. It's empirical. On the other hand, it's also tentative. And sadly, science education is not very good. And people think science is about proving things. And science has nothing to do with proving things. Science is all about tentative proofs, a demonstration like this is as good as we get. If I throw this up in the air, it's going to come down. That's why we call it a law of gravity. But, it's not inconceivable that it stays up at one point because something violates that law. But this is one kind of truth, the kind of stuff you can see. You know, if you don't believe force equals mass times acceleration, stand in the middle of a street and see what happens, right? Because you'll see that force equals mass times acceleration. That's one kind of truth. There's another kind of truth, which has nothing to do with necessarily empirical demonstration. It has to do with truth has to do with rules. Each truth domain has its own set of rules for determining truth. There's a kind of truth of math or logic. There are rules for how you do math. There are rules about how you do logic. If a statement is logically valid, that is, it follows the rules of logic, we can say it's true. It might not be really true. It's true within those rules. When we do truths in algebra, they're true. They may not have any relationship to anything real, but it doesn't matter. They're true in that sense of within those rules, we can say something about them. But then she talks about another kind of truth, which is a truth that is really about how you feel about the integrity and credibility of the person making a claim to truth. And as academics, we use that kind of truth a lot because we put citations in saying we believe Aristotle actually is, you know, he's telling you what he thinks is the truth. So it's when we make truths both of science or of truth one, which I'll mention in a second, we can say my rule is that I trust the person making the claim. I might not agree with them even, but I can say this person, I believe that person is telling me something that they really believe is true, even though I might not believe it. I don't think they're trying to deceive me. And finally, there are these kind of truths, which are the truths that we often think about in truth, which is the truths that sit on nothing at all except that we believe them. You know, religious truth, metaphysical truth, even philosophical truths. They can't be demonstrated in a logical way necessarily or in an empirical way. We just accept them. The problems happen in our world, I think, when these kind of truths intersect with these other kinds of truths. You know, it's really hard to say, for example, that evolution through natural selection is not true. In a truth for sense, you know, it's as good an explanation as we have as to how the world how the world has emerged. But if you have a belief, you know, a literal belief in Genesis book 1 that doesn't give you any leeway, well, when those come into conflict, we'll keep the things that define who we are ourselves, which are our truth ones, and we dump the others, and that causes lots of conflict and grief. So I'm playing around with a chapter, 4,000 or so words, about truth in this context. Then I began doing this little bit of searching, you know, because untruth, which you could call lies, this was interesting. This is Google Scholar. When we talk about philosophy of truth, the philosophers are interested in truth, and the psychologists are interested in lies. Now, that was kind of interesting. I don't know exactly what it means. But I just put this long quote from Hannah Arendt up because, first of all, I really like Hannah Arendt. She's another one of my go-to philosopher types. But she talks about the problem of lying in society and the idea that lies have to be changed. Lying governments have to continually change their lies. And again, we're seeing this right in front of us, just south of the border here. And the problem is, it's not that when you live in a world of lies, you don't believe anything. You just give up worrying about what you should believe. And as he said, as she says, your mind is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also to think and to judge. And then you can do anything you want with people like this. So she's a person who grew out of Nazi Germany, experienced totalitarian regimes. This kind of stuff is very interesting, and it's around us. And when I point to the U.S., that's not the only place in the world where this kind of lying, this untruth is happening. It's really important, I think, for scholars, especially, and for young people, and that's who I think might even lean this towards more. We have to have ways of discerning untruths. That empirical untruths are kind of easy to find because, you do experiments, and if someone says, I don't believe that experiment, the proper response is, do it again. You do it this time. One of my colleagues, when I was a grad student at UBC, did a big, very powerful PhD dissertation on the impact of these small critters in mud. Got a big job, really fabulous research, could not be replicated. I don't think he was lying, but it could not be replicated. That is, it may not be true. Something happens, he did something, still don't know what. But because science truths are tentative truths, they're the best that we have up to the point we're in now, we can get rid of untruths in science. If any of you took maybe biology in high school, you probably mostly did. If you were to go back and take biology 12 exam now and answer it with what you knew in high school that got you A's, you'd fail, right? But we don't tell people that. We say science, that's truth, but it's not. It's always being undone. And we can look at truth threes to find untruths. We have rules of argumentation that tell us logical mistakes can be made, and if they make logical mistake, that truth can't be found out, can't be held any longer. And it can be made dishonestly. A logical argument can be made dishonestly, but it can be called out and it can be got rid of. But someone who's trying to deceive you, is trying to convince you that something is truth too, when in fact they know it's not truth too. When they're trying to deceive you, this is a real problem because you can be deceived. We just had a woman defend her doctorate here at Royal Roads last summer whose DSOC Psi was about high-stakes deception. That's what she was looking at, and she was looking at a member of my family engaged in high-stakes deception. So Jack Harrich, who's a very interesting systems guy down in Georgia, he came up with some ideas for how do we how do we tell things are not true. He came up with what he calls a truth test. And he says, lots of tricks to, little devices you can use to trick people into thinking something is true that isn't. He says, we could train people to watch for logical fallacies and how to detect lies. But even more so, he says, we need to look for strategies that people are using to try to deceive us. And he says, these are 4 things. I'm not going to spend time with them. But we should be able to look at arguments that were offered, and he says are offered by our political leaders and rulers, and ask them, what are they actually claiming or arguing? And are there any common patterns of deception? Like, do people make false promises? He would say when you see a false promise made, you have to completely reduce the integrity quotient of that person making it. Do people create false enemies to convince you that what they want to do is right? Do people press the fear hot button? Again, we're seeing all of these now. Do people demonstrate clearly wrong priorities for the larger, for the greater good? Think again down south of the border about the tax bill. And secrecy. He says secrecy by itself allows all these others to occur. So when you see these kinds of things happen, you should be prepared to detect deception. And then a few other pieces there. So I want to play around with untruths. I want to, Harry Frankfurt is a professor at Princeton University, and he wrote this book a number of years ago called On Bullshit. Now, it was really great because it really allowed philosophers to use this kind of language. They don't normally speak this way, but he gave them permission to it. And he contrasts a liar with a bullshitter, right? He says the liar, is the fact about himself that the liar hides is that he's attempting to lead us away from for a correct apprehension of reality. We're not to know that. That's what a liar does. But the bullshitter has no concern about truth or lies per se. And there is a lot we live with in the realm of bullshit. And it's I first ran across this idea before the word bullshit was applied to it. I don't know what I do next here. When I was a young teacher, back in 1974, when I went out to be a high school teacher in Ucluelet on the west coast of the island, I brought with me this new book called Teaching as a Subversive Activity, right, by Neil Postman and Charles Weingartner. And the big thing I took from that book was crap detecting. That was the most important thing for teachers to help students develop, a sense of how do you detect crap. And crap is another form of bullshit. And he says that these are some of the ways you can detect that, bullshit or crap. People, pomposity. I got a call yesterday from a guy who introduces himself all the time to me as Professor so-and-so. Now, he's a professor honorary causa and honoraris causa, right? He's not a professor, and yet he really is very pompous trying to convince me to do something for him. That bullshitters, Frankfurt feels, have no tolerance for things that don't fit into their view. They're inane. He has a big piece on inanity. The fact when I was teaching at the museum, I used to do workshops with kids from schools in the province, and I had Pacific Christian School, which I really liked, the one out in the highway, Dutch Reformed Church School, and they came to a workshop with me on classification theory. Classification theory in biology is all based on evolution. So that's what I would talk about. Except with these kids, I know they don't believe in evolution. I didn't want to offend them. I wasn't concerned about, I didn't want to get into that. So I could teach them how we kind of mechanically and mathematically do classification. At the end of this workshop, this little girl, little gleam in her eye says, "Do you believe in evolution?" And off we went for an hour. And it was really great. Except when the teacher came up, demonstrated the bullshit of the isolated fact. He said, "Well, what about the second law of thermodynamics?" Like that was, he read that in the pamphlet on how to debate evolutionists and win. The second law is energy in a closed system runs down, right? But the Earth is a deeply open system to energy from all sorts of places. But again, that kind of thing. Bullshit, right? I didn't say that because they were kids from a Christian school. Right? And then this idea of bullshit can be hidden as unclarifiable unclarity. So, don't you just love words like that? That's why you read widely, so you can find them. So there's a chapter on bullshit, which hopefully, and then there's a chapter on stupidity. So in the last year or so, I ran across this German author, Austrian author, Robert Musil, who wrote a 2-volume unfinished novel called The Man Without Qualities. Ava, did you ever run across this as a student? No? It's an astonishing 2-volume, never got around to finish it, wasn't Jewish, but he escaped out of Austria and spent a few years in Switzerland before he died. Man Without Qualities. But he gave this lecture. This is a lecture to the Austrian, I'm saying Werkbunds would be like the assembly of workers, right? Like a union, a group of unions maybe, held in Vienna, Austria, in March 1937. Not yet. The Anschluss hasn't happened yet, right? The Germans have not yet come into Vienna. Okay. So he's standing up and doing what people are doing in the United States right now, right? He's talking about the times, and he's calling it über die Dummheit, right? On stupidity. It's not even really on stupidity. How would you German speakers, Niels, is that a good way of saying it? The über is a little bit about stupidity, but it's done as on. That's the way it's done. And this whole little set of essays, well, not essays, there's 2 lectures, and they're hard to find, and unbelievably UVic had the poetry journal that they're published in. So that was totally great. But this is what he's saying, that stupidity is every place. It's like, because it's full of lies. And I love this last line. The truth, on the other hand, has only ever one garment and one way forward, and is always at a disadvantage. So when I looked up, again, on Google Scholar, philosophy of stupidity has 4 hits. The psychology of stupidity has 20 hits. In other words, it's not a domain that people are writing about. There's a little bit of literature on stupidity, but it's not a lot of literature, not on those 2 domains. Here's one classic story about stupidity, about Thales Mileti, one of the great early scientists, fell into a well while he was contemplating the heavens. The moral is straightforward. Hobbies can be dangerous and sagacity can be stupid. Why did it do that? But what is being referred to in that story is two different kinds of, potentially, a couple kinds of stupidity. One kind of stupidity is just, just not being particularly bright, doing things that are, plain forwardly stupid. But there's another kind of stupidity, which is what is being talked about here and used by a German historian named Erich Voegelin. Voegelin, historian, again, not a Jewish philosopher, historian, but left Germany, and gave an amazing set of lectures in 1962 in Munich called Hitler and the Germans. This is stupidity. And to me, this really hit me. That a man, because of his loss of reality or loss of ability to contemplate reality, again, that word reality is referring in some ways to the truth 4, truth 3 version of reality, is not in a position to rightly orient his action in the world in which he lives. And that's when people in power can act stupid in this sense, we're all at risk, right? When this kind of stupidity occurs. That what stupidity has to do, get back here. What stupidity has to do with is an unwillingness to confront the world. Instead, to say that the world should be the way we think it should be and act as if that's the case. Now, we know psychopathology often is about that, right? That we think the world should behave in a certain way, we act in the way we think we should be acting to make the world work for us, and it repeatedly doesn't work for us. There's a pathological dimension to it. I'm only going to go as far as stupidity. So those are the first 4, and then I'm going to finish with 2, only one of which is here. I've written about hope. In 2005, I was giving what was really the first paper in the environmental education world about hope. I was going to a congress in Torino, but before I went to Torino, I spoke at a Canadian environmental education gathering. So the Canadian environmental education gang, we like to get together not in hotels. In this particular case, we were going to go to Camp Taiwango, which is in the Muskokas. It's a kids' camp. There's canoes with kids' handprints on it from the 30s, right? One of those places. So I was giving my workshop Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. This group tends to party hard also, and so Sunday morning at 9 o'clock could be a slow time for the conference. Saturday night, the keynote speaker was Dr. Bill Reese. Bill's an old friend of mine, and he's a professor he was a new assistant professor when I was a grad student at UBC, and he's the father of the concept, the ecological footprint. How much space do any of us take up on the planet in terms of fulfilling our needs and desires? And Bill is a wee bit depressed, and has been so for 20, 30 years. His research has radicalized him and kind of depressed him. And he gave a talk to this group of environmental educators who know this stuff, and it was hugely depressing. So the next morning, 9 o'clock, I figured I'd have about 10% of the conference at my session. It was about 300 or so people. I thought I'd get 20 to 30 people in my session. I had 100 people try to get into this little room. We had to move into a lobby and rejig everything around because everyone was so bummed out by Bill Reese that they wanted to my talk was called Hope and Despair in Environmental Education. And they wanted to talk about hope. And so I gave this paper there, and I gave a paper in Turin as well. But I realize I'm less and less interested in hope per se, because there's a passive quality to hope. And I'm interested in the fact that we have to do things, right? And my dissertation in 1997 was about deeds. And in as much as I'm very aware that this topic orients my life, and that's why it would be the last chapter, just again, telling personally, so my mother was a child Holocaust survivor. She was hidden by a Dutch family. In as much as she wasn't meant to live, I wasn't meant to exist. So my existence hangs on the moral actions of other people. And I'm aware of that all the time. I carry that with me all the time. And so courage really is important to me. Because not the, Aristotle lays out, says courage is here, and that's the mean between rashness and cowardice. Right? So I'm not talking about the guys you see in extreme sports. I don't know if that's courage or rashness. Winston Churchill talks about courage as the first of human qualities because it guarantees all those other qualities, all those other virtues, as Rorty would say, their space. So, not much interest in education 4. When you put the 4 in there, you don't find much about courage. So I'm going to play with this, and this is the 5th chapter, which I'm laying. I'm structuring. The other 4 I've got a lot written. This one I've got some written. And then the one on action is really, I'm going to take my dissertation, and I think I know what I'm going to do with that. So that's more or less the writing that I was there. But then I got involved with a couple of other projects. Rita Serra is a totally wonderful woman who's at SESH, and she's done very interesting work with commoners. Now, when I say the word commoner to you, you think about, there's the Queen, and then there's commoners. But the commoners are actually people who have, the kinds of people that Brian works with. They're people who have rights to access resources in a common. And so she was working with mushroom harvesters in commons in Portugal, and the changes that have gone on since the revolution took place in 1974. So she had a paper that had been accepted and was not in good enough English. They liked the idea, but they weren't going to do it. It didn't come out quite right. Anyways, I went through her paper, and she gave me a nice recognition up on the top. So published on mushroom and communities. And then Albert, who was my neighbor, is trying to get this thing together on this totally interesting topic of poaching rhinos. And so I'm working with him on getting that paper. So again, a relationship that began through, simply where I ended up living, led to one paper getting published. Maybe it would have been anyways, but maybe in a little better form and a little faster. And I think it'd be wonderful if Albert's paper will make it as well. Yes. And then from there, I got interested in questions about the commons from talking with Rita, and I guess I'll quickly finish to one. I'm sorry for maybe going a little too long. I never exactly know how. These are all unrehearsed, So this is a paper that I've written, and I'm now trying to fix. I've started writing it when I was there. I'd had it in my head for years. It was a lecture I'd given, but I'd never written it down. It's about 3 First Nations experiences I've had. One was out in the Stein Valley when I worked in BC Parks, when we first co-managed this beautiful valley for the first time with a First Nations group after lots of political process. The First Nations people wrote an essay that prefaced the Stein document, the co-management document, and it said this: "For us to exist as a people and as a culture, we need to preserve certain of our lands, the only rightful place we have on this earth, in their natural state." And when I read this, it wrecked my whole day. It wrecked weeks, because I wondered, what does a rightful place mean? What does it mean to have a right? We own places, but they weren't talking about owning it. They were talking about this place by right. And I'd never thought of this. And so I think this is an important concept as we think about sustainability and rightfulness of place. How do we make a place rightful when we're not from here? The second, and I spin off on that a bit. The second story is from an old lady at Heshquit. My affinities with First Nations are with the Nuu-chah-nulth people on the west coast of the island. And in this program, this old lady asked this group of non-Indigenous people, "When are you white folks going to start living like you plan on staying here?" And again, it sort of knocks you out, this idea. What do you mean, plan on staying here, living like you plan on staying? That isn't our cultural history as Westerners. Our history is use it up, move on. And she's saying, you're going to stay? Not just stay here in Heshquit where we were talking with her, but staying here, like on the planet. And so there's a sustainability story in this, and that's the second part of the story. And the third part comes from a meeting with elders up in the Yukon, and we were asking these old people, and these were old people, this was 1990, and so they were probably around my age now, and we were asking them about their grandparents. How did their grandparents teach you to be environmentally responsible? Their grandparents would have been born maybe in the 1870s or so. yeah, 1870s, 1880s. And they talked about having to learn respect for the land and the animals and the plants and other elders. And then there was a problem if you didn't show respect. Because if you didn't show respect when you were little, well, that's okay. You don't know any better, so you get taught. But if you know better, you get spanked. And they all talked about being punished, about being spanked if they didn't show the proper respect. And these were the old ladies, and they're laughing and laughing about this business of being spanked. But spanking, getting your uncle spanking you, is much less damaging than having the grizzly bear spank you. And so if the most important thing you know is how to live sustainably in one place, this rightful place, living like you plan on staying there, you spank your children when they don't do things right, because the improvisation is very likely to not work. And so, you know, the end of that story also grew out of my sabbatical is this kind of stuff. And I think we have to take this seriously, from the lies, the deceit, the bullshit, the stupidity, and the need for courage. You know, this has just come out. There's 36,000 scientists. I signed this. Maybe Brian signed it as well. You know, when we look at what's going on in terms of curves of things going up when they should go down and going down when they should go up, you know, we're at a difficult point in the world's history. When we look at what the Stockholm Sustainability Institute talks about planetary boundaries, and we see the possibilities of exceeding planetary boundaries, is very much, you know, it's happening in our lives now. It's going to take courage to confront what do we do with what we have. And so this stuff, while it comes, you know, out of my science stuff and out of my philosophical stuff and my cultural interest stuff, it's this writing that I've done over the last 6 months has really been very much a reflection of me as an omnivore, as I said at the beginning. And with that, I think that's the end of it. Oh, this is we'll put the music on when you leave, but this is called the Serenade, the music at the Queima das Fitas. So this is the beginning of a week-long student festival. There's probably 12,000 people. They're all dressed like Harry Potter. And I'd say 80% of them are as drunk as skunks. And there's not a single policeman there, because police aren't invited onto the campus because of the problems of the dictatorship. The students police themselves. And that's the rules. That's the rules. And I saw lots of drunk students and nothing going on. And this is outside of the old cathedral, and it's quite extraordinary. So you can, yeah, just put it on low.
É preciso acreditar, é preciso acreditar, é preciso gritar. E quem faz o sorriso é um bem para se guardar, que é luar para se guardar, que é luar ao sol de graça, que nos vai alumiar, É preciso acreditar, é preciso acreditar, é preciso acreditar. Quem trabalha e a canção é um bem para se guardar, que não há